and welcome to Racing Rundown for 2023's Kentucky Oaks preview. It is finally that time of year on Racing Rundown, and just a quick little look ahead at what is coming up this week. Of course, this is Kentucky Derby week, so we will have this Kentucky Oaks preview / pick show alongside of our Kentucky Derby show, which will be linked below in the description. Of course, we also have the Kentucky Derby profiles that we put out over the course of last week. We still have a couple with horses that we were either waiting on riders, or we did get a new horse that drew in to the Kentucky Derby last week. So we're still finishing those up, but those will be done obviously before Kentucky Derby Day. There is a playlist with all of those profiles that will be linked below in the description, so you can check that out. And then, as always, we have our regular podcast platform where we put out weekly episodes of Racing Rundown. So with that being said, we're going to get into the Kentucky Oaks on this episode, going to go through all 14 of the main starters with also some brief mentions of the also eligibles, because as we learned last year, we can't ignore the also eligibles. In one aspect, we didn't obviously last year, but we didn't talk about Rich Strike or Rattle and Roll on our main Kentucky Derby pick show. So we're going to rectify that this year and talk about both of the horses that or all of the horses that are also eligibles. We have 14 main starters and 3 also eligibles for the Kentucky Oaks. Obviously, one of them draws in with a scratch, and I believe the deadline for the Kentucky Oaks is probably Thursday at 8:30. I don't know that for sure. I just know that the deadline for the Derby is Friday at 8:30 or 9:30, whatever one of the 30s is. Point is, 24 hours, at least 24 hours before the race day. Actually, I think 36 hours is the official one. Whatever my inability to do math aside, we are going to get into the first horse on this Kentucky Oaks preview. And while I normally introduce horses, I have been talking for the last 2 minutes, and I am joined by Eric, as always. And even though Eric, you might explain this a little bit, not exactly here in one piece per se, but we are ready to get started with this. So I will let you introduce the first starter in the Kentucky Oaks, and we'll get on our way.
Yes, and like you mentioned, Jack, I had a little bit too good of a weekend out in Santa Anita leading into this without remembering that we had a big, busy day of previews to come. But regardless, we're here, we're fighting through, and I apologize for any miscellaneous stoppages, loss of words, or voice cracks that'll come along the way. But we'll start with Mimi Kakushi, a very unique contender coming in from the UAE. Not the first time we've seen this, actually. A few years ago, Rhea ran in the Kentucky Oaks, although she was switched to the Bob Baffert barn for her outing. Mimi Kakushi stays with trainer Salim bin Gadire after making 5 starts in the UAE, all at Maidan over their carnival, and even before then. She's on a 3-race win streak, won the Guineas Trial, the Guineas, and then the UAE Oaks last time out, but also hasn't ran since mid-February. That's where she picked up the 50 points necessary to get in the Kentucky Oaks. On class, she's definitely going to be a step below, because beating Middle Eastern fillies doesn't have much, much say when it comes to Kentucky Oaks. But I will say the one thing she does have that most of these other horses don't is distance experience. She's one of the mile and 316, so she actually gets to cut back a little bit this time around.
And that's pretty much where I am with Mimi Kakushi. Obviously, her wins in the Middle East were quite strong, but there's not really a whole lot of form to back those up. And on one aspect, these 3-year-old fillies this year aren't really that strong, but at the same time, it's something that's never really been done before. It has never been done before. A horse coming from the United Arab Emirates and winning the Kentucky Oaks. Even Shahama, who last year won the UAE Oaks and then was moved to Todd Pletcher, did some good running in subsequent stakes races after the Kentucky Oaks was not able to turn in a good effort there. So Mimi Kakushi, the trip experience is certainly a positive for her, but it will be an uphill climb for her to be able to win the Kentucky Oaks, just because she didn't really beat a whole lot. There's not a whole lot of form to her that she faced in the UAE Oaks. So she will be a pass for both of us in this race. We'll move on to the second of 2 horses in this, or the the number 2 horse, and the first of 3, I flipped my words a little bit there, the first of 3 horses for Brad Cox in this race, and that's the Alys Look, who is coming into this race off of a placing effort in the Louisiana, or down at the fairgrounds in the Fairgrounds Oaks. She ran on the Louisiana Kentucky Oaks Trail, 3rd in the Fairgrounds Oaks. She won the Silver Bullet Day back in January over the very well-backed Chop Chop on both that day and then on Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies Day. She was also 2nd in the Untappable behind Pretty Mischievous, who we will get to later, also contests the Kentucky Oaks, but is very much further out than the Alys Look is. She is, I think, very clearly the 3rd best of the 3 Brad Cox horses in this race. I happen to like one of them. We will get to that later on in this race, but I thought that her race in the Silver Bullet Day that she won was rather uninspiring. I wasn't the biggest fan of Chop Chop in the Breeders' Cup, and then I really didn't like Chop Chop coming out of that race, and it just kind of felt like the Alys Look took advantage of a race that had a very weak group of horses that showed up in it, and then her 3rd place finish in the Fairgrounds Oaks enough to get her to the Kentucky Oaks, but I don't really think it gives her a whole lot of form to win this race. And then she was also beaten by Pretty Mischievous in the Untappable, and then also Pretty Mischievous finished in front of her in the Fairgrounds Oaks. So beaten on 2 occasions by Pretty Mischievous. The one thing is that she has over Pretty Mischievous this time is she has a better draw than Pretty Mischievous does, but she will be a pass for me in this race.
And she was actually a horse I considered quite a bit, but I eventually did pass on her. But I think she has intriguing qualities. I thought the Silver Bullet, it was a really good race. Even though she did have to work against Chop Chop, they still dominated the rest of the field. But the Fairgrounds Oaks was just such a disappointing performance. She when you look at it, had the right trip, but she was off a pace that did not hold up at all, and was not able to take any advantage of it, and looked very flat coming down the lane. So she's been hit or miss throughout her career. The 2 stakes losses definitely stand out more than the wins. The one win, I should say, when it comes to the stakes level. And, you're right. I just think that when she's lost to Pretty Mischievous, or like I was saying about last time out, there really hasn't been a good reason. She's just looked a couple low, and I don't see that being any different here come Friday.
And now we're going to move on to the number 3 horse in this race, the team that brings Forte to the Kentucky Derby, favor to the Kentucky Derby, also brings a filly that will certainly not be as well backed as Forte will be, but that's Gambling Girl for the Pletcher, Rapoli, and Irad Ortiz team. And Gambling Girl comes out of a 2nd in the Gazelle, and she has some interesting qualities to her, especially when you look at her experience at this 1 1/8 trip. So she's got 3 career efforts over it, which is one of the most amongst horses in this field over this kind of a trip. She was 2nd last time behind Promisher America in the Gazelle, 2nd to Busana behind a Colt, and then she was 3rd in the Demoiselle behind Julia Shining and Affirmative Lady. Now, she's got some okay back class, and specifically if you wanted to lean on the Demoiselle, because Affirmative Lady did win the Gulfstream Park Oaks, and Julia Shining is a horse that both of us still, even though she didn't make the body of this Kentucky Oaks field, is a horse that we still hold in pretty high regard. But at the same time, she didn't have enough in her, was not making up enough ground to catch Promisher America, and it almost seems like maybe she might want to go a little bit further. I'm not really sure. It just kind of, it seems like there's she left a lot to be desired there, and given the price that she's at, I think it's very odd, and I'll give Eric an opportunity to get into that a little bit more, how much of an odds disparity there is between her and the horse who finished in front of her in the Gazelle. And I can understand that to a certain extent, because she does have okay back class, but a Colt isn't the best horse in the world, and the horse who beat her in the Demoiselle, while we both hold Julia Shining in high regard, is not in the body of the Kentucky Oaks field. So I don't know if back class warrants the disparity in the odds, but again, another horse that I will be passing on, just because I don't think, since she wasn't able to get the job done last time, and she's going the same trip here, I don't see what changes.
And I'm in a similar boat here. I just think she's just proven to be a couple low again and again and again. She's finished behind four different runners in this race at different times in their careers. Behind Julia Shining and Affirmative Lady, Wet Paint, Two Back, Promisher America last time out. Even though Julia Shining's not technically in, I think that just goes to emphasize the overall fact that she just can't beat these horses, always seeming a couple low. And she makes these good moves. The Gazelle, she threatened quite a bit of a stretch and was never able to get by Promisher America. The Honeybee, she started moving well on the turn, but then just flattened out at points. It's just a recurring theme from her, and I just don't see what's any different. You did mention the distance thing. I initially thought that as well, but then I came to realize, she's run a mile and an eighth three times in her career. It's not like she's going to get to go any further this time round. So I just don't see where the ground can be made up on the competition. She just is yet to prove that she is better than some other contenders in here, good or not. And I don't see why that would change on this big of a stage.
And now we're going to move on to the number 4 horse in this race, and that is Southlawn for trainer Norm Cassie. And Southlawn's a very intriguing horse in this race, especially when you take a look at what recent work she's done. So she has not the greatest form line when you look at her from a record perspective, but several of those races are muddied by a couple of runs on turf. The 4th and 5th starts of her career at Keeneland and Churchill, respectively, on October 28th and November 20th, those were turf races. And so you can kind of toss those when you're looking at her from the perspective of the Kentucky Oaks. She lost to Wonder Wheel at Churchill at first asking on June 3rd of last year, but that was an early start for a 3-year-old filly. So that was, I will mention, that was on dirt though. But she, in 5 of her career races, she has run on dirt, and she's won 3 of those. 2 of them unplaced, but I mentioned one was in her first start, and the other one was in the Pocahontas, which can kind of be a sink or float type race for those horses that are getting the move up in trip very early in their career. And it was a sink moment for Southlawn, but after the run on turf at Churchill on November 20th, she was given time off by Norm Cassie, and then she moved back up to the mile and a 16th, and she won that race by 8 lengths, and she siphoned that into a win in the Fairgrounds Oaks. So you can look at multiple aspects of improvement. One of them is certainly getting the dirt, which it seems like she would prefer, which it makes sense why she would have tried the turf, because she's by Pioneer of the Nile, and Pioneer of the Nile horses can do both things, but it clearly seems that she found something that works for her in the past couple of races, and she's also coming out of a career best effort and improving into this race. So the Fairgrounds Oaks was a good win in there. She won over 3 fillies who were all stakes winners at one point. Pretty Mischievous, a couple stakes wins. She won the Untappable and the Rachel Alexander. The Alys Look, we already mentioned, she won the Silver Bullet Day. And then Hoosier Filly was the Kentucky Oaks favorite throughout the course of the winter, with her wins in the Rags to Riches and in the Goldenrod. So Southlawn is coming into this race off of probably figuring out what her issues were, getting the opportunity to grow into herself, and then, regardless of how you view the horses that I mentioned, they're all graded stakes winners. So she has some good back class to her name also from the Fairgrounds Oaks. She makes a lot of sense going into this race as a horse that is continuing to improve and will make her her third start of this season.
Yeah, I think you nailed it on the head there. She's just a completely different horse than she was as a 2-year-old. I mean, obviously showed a glimpse of her talent when breaking her maiden, but struggled in the Pocahontas and then the 2 losses. But I just think I think the biggest thing with her is the confidence. She looks like a confident racehorse in her 2 starts in 2023. If you watch the allowance win, she made a really good middle move under Ray Luke Gutierrez after he sets a slow pace, put her in the game, and she just took off from there. The fact that she opened up 3-4 lengths into the turn and then never looked back was really eye-catching. And then in the Fairgrounds Oaks, the race did set up really well for her. I mean, she had to make up ground into a really hot pace pretty easy, but she finished off with so much power, galloped out nicely, and that's another thing. The Kentucky Oaks is such the mile and a 16th to mile and an 8th jump is quite a significant difference, and some really appreciate it, some don't. Southlawn by my projections off these 2 runs, seems like she's clearly going to like the added ground, and the pedigree would definitely add on to that theory. So she's just doing a lot of good. I just think the biggest thing is, can she win a graded stakes without getting the perfect setup, which, there might be a little pace to run into, but it certainly won't be as favorable as the Fairgrounds Oaks was.
And now we're going to move on to the reigning champion 2-year-old Wonder Wheel, who we mentioned last time, or who we mentioned in talking about Southlawn, because she beat Southlawn when she debuted and also when Southlawn debuted. And Wonder Wheel obviously was the entire package as a 2-year-old filly. She won the Alcibiades and the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies en route to her championship 2-year-old season. And she comes into the Kentucky Oaks with 2 starts this year. One of them was in the Suncoast, which I thought was a good race for her, considering that Tampa can be a very speed-biased track to begin with, and that day on the Suncoast was exceptionally biased towards speed horses, and I thought that she ran a good second behind Dreaming of Snow, and I liked that run so much that I picked her in the in the Ashland at Keeneland, and I thought that was just a big step back for her. And I wonder if that was kind of an indication of the rest of the pack catching up with Wonder Wheel, because the Ashland, there wasn't really anything that was like looking at it, okay, she's got a major excuse coming for her in this race, and it was at the track where she had done her best work at last year as a 2-year-old, going the mile and a 16th trip that she won both the Alcibiades and the Juvenile Fillies at. So I was really disappointed by the effort that she turned in there, and it was enough to make me look at her and say, okay, I think she's kind of regressed to the mean, and there's a couple other 3-year-old fillies in this race that I think have improved quite a bit in their couple of starts, or however many starts that they have coming into the Kentucky Oaks, and I don't really think Wonder Wheel has matched that. I'm comfortable saying at this point, given the way that she ran in way that she ran in the Ashland, I really think that her best races probably seem to be behind her, and I'm going to err on that side going into this race.
And I will as well. I think this is obviously a filly who had a lot of talent, but we harped on it all last year that crop of 2-year-old fillies was weak, and that heading into 2023 there'd have to be someone that took this step forward and or emerged that hadn't run yet, and we've seen those in certain spots. They don't really apply, though, to Wonder Wheel, because the Suncoast was a good run, but then Dreaming of Snow didn't even come back to run well. And Julia Shining, who we both like still has not really taken her next step. So for Wonder Wheel, the Ashland, you can maybe say, it was a one-off bad performance, but even by speed figures, I mean, she just has not gotten any better than what she was doing a year ago. So, I wouldn't be surprised to see her maybe take a little bit of a step forward, but I can also confidently say that she really has not looked any different than last year with all these other fillies catching up. So I'm also going to be one to probably pass on her, but if you feel that the Ashland was a one-off performance, you can definitely make a case, and you're going to get a really good price on a 2-year-old champion.
And now we're going to move on to number 6 in the second of 3 Brad Cox horses in this race, and that is Botanical, winner of the Bourbonnette Oaks at Turfway, and she's also won 4 straight races at Turfway going back to November of last year. 6 lifetime starts to her. Has not run on dirt, though, and that's really going to be the elephant in the room for Botanical coming into this race. Now, one thing that I will say, the numbers of Turfway shippers going to Churchill Downs from that synthetic surface to the dirt are very good. I apologize that I don't have them in front of me, but the numbers are pretty good for that. So I'm not really that concerned about her getting the dirt, or about her getting in the dirt. Now, 2 starts to begin her career on turf. One was at Kentucky Downs, and it was not a good effort for her, but I can always toss out a poor effort at Kentucky Downs because that's a race where horses kind of sink or float. The next start was at Keeneland going a mile and a 16th, where she was beaten less than a length. But one thing that she did when she went to Turfway is Brad Cox switched her to being a front-running horse, and she turned that into 4 straight wins. She won an allowance in January by 4.5 lengths. Then she won the Cincinnati Trophy by 6.5, and then she jumped up last time to the Bourbonnette Oaks. She only won that by 2.5 lengths, but the filly who she beat for second, Flashy Gem, was 7 lengths clear of the rest of the horses in the Bourbonnette Oaks. And I think Flashy Gem is a talented filly in her own right. Unfortunately, did not accumulate the points to be here for the Kentucky Oaks, but I think, again, quality 3-year-old filly. And Botanical has run some of the best races visually in this Kentucky Oaks. I'm not necessarily going to get into the metrics side as much with her, but I just think that the efforts that she has turned in, specifically in the Cincinnati Trophy and the Bourbonnette Oaks, were very, very strong efforts. As I said, I'm not worried about her getting the surface here. I think that the switch from the all-weather to the dirt is fine, and she's a horse that I really, really like going into the Kentucky Oaks.
And I think you have every right to like her because of what she's done. Obviously, the lack of dirt form is concerning, but I think with how she's trained over it and her pedigree, it really should not be a problem. And you laid out her resume to this point, just win after win after win. And I think you can maybe knock the quality of the company in those, but at the same time, it's not like this crop is filled with a bunch of standouts. I think the biggest knock heading into this will be how the race shapes up, because she has, like you kind of mentioned, Jack, done her best work on the lead. I mean, she rated in the Cincinnati Trophy, but I don't think that will be the game plan here. But there could be pressure from Flying Connection, probably the biggest contender there. But even Defining Purpose, Dorth Vader, they like to sit pretty close. That's where they do their best running, and Pretty Mischievous, even from the outside, will add blinkers. And I know we'll get to all that. But I think talent won't be Botanical. It'll be the setup more than anything. But I think you'd be playing the wrong horse if you think she'll, no pun intended there, but if you think she'll run a bad race on Oaks Day.
And now we're going to move on to the third Brad Cox horse in this race, and that is Wet Paint, the morning line favorite for the Kentucky Oaks. And she's another horse who comes into this race with just win after win. Now, she was another one who was started at Kentucky Downs. Turf didn't work for her. Brad Cox ran her at Horseshoe Indianapolis, which is very interesting that his two best horses in the Derby and the Oaks, respectively, both started their win, or had their maiden breaking wins at Horseshoe, Indiana. And then from there, she ran at Turfway in December, was second there, and then rattled off the 3 straight wins at Oaklawn, which are good on the surface, but it's very fair to question the level of horses that she beat, because the horses in the 3-year-old fillies in Arkansas this year certainly very weak, and she beat the same group of horses 3 straight times, and that's certainly something that, it's only good to a certain point, and it's fair to ask, okay, well, can Wet Paint do it against slightly better horses? Now, she's not coming into the Kentucky Oaks against a bunch of world beaters, and that's certainly fair to say, okay, well, that's a little bit disingenuous to her because she's not having to take that much of a step up in competition. But at the same time, it also is something that I'm going to knock her for, because it has been the same groups of horses that she beat all in all. Now, again, there were different horses underneath, but for the most part, Taxed, Olivia Twist, Grand Love, Towhead, Take Charge, Brianna, those are all the horses that she was running against in the Martha Washington. Those are all the horses in the Honeybee, and those were all the horses in the Fantasy. And the other thing is she also tripped out 3 straight times. Now, there are more horses, that there are probably a fair amount of horses that want to do their running on the front end, so I don't think that Wet Paint is going to run into a situation where she's not going to get where she will lose because there will be a crawling pace in front of her. Again, I just question her. I don't think she's that much better than the rest of this group. I prefer Botanical, her stablemate, to her, and I think that there are a couple other horses that you can make the case are right on her level, and in that situation, it would just be a matter of who you think is going to get first run on her. And I think that's also something to think about. One of those other horses that will, because she will be certainly right at the back, and some of those third flight mid-pack horses will certainly get first run on Wet Paint. And that's, I think, another thing that I will mention is a negative that I bring to her going into this race. But she's a deserving favorite because she is doing one of the most important things in racing, and that's having won 3 straight races. And I certainly do value wins more than I think the average handicapper would or does.
Yeah, I think when you look at Wet Paint, a deserving favorite is improving. I think my biggest thing against her is that she has been beating up on the same horses in her last 3 races. It's just been horses that hope that wet paint would be beatable. They wheeled back into the next race, and it didn't work out for them. So we know she's the best where she's coming from. Does that mean she's the best in the crop? Who knows? But she's one I really don't think will run poorly. I think that there will be pace for her to close into. I think that she's the best of the true deep closing types. The ones that present themselves here, and like I said, I think the improvement is evident. So she's going to be coming. It could be a little too late, like you were mentioning, and she is still relatively unexposed from a quality competition perspective. But she's done it all right. But she does seem beatable in those senses. But I'd feel silly leaving her off any tickets just because she is a consistent horse in an inconsistent group of horses.
And now we're going to move on to the number 8 horse in this race, Promisher America. And I would be remiss to not toss it back to you, Eric, because I want you to introduce this horse. And I know your sentimental favorite for this Kentucky Oaks.
Absolutely. Trained by my former boss, Ray Handel, one of the best young trainers in the game. And he's done great work with this filly, going from a maiden special weight that she won in her 3rd career start to winning the Grade 3 Gazelle, his first career graded stakes in her very next start. It's had a really good trip, does keep Jorge Vargas on for the Oaks. And while the field wasn't great, there were proven horses in there, at least regionally. Cheetah Booty, a colt, Gambling Girl had been knocking on the door, as we previously mentioned. So for Promisher America, she beat an okay field, and she'll be able to sit a good trip when you draw this race up. It seems like she'll be able to be within a length or 2 of the lead, right in behind 2 or 3 speeds. So it all makes sense. It's just will talent be able to lift itself up? We haven't seen enough of her to really know. She's very light on her speed figure, so there's quite a few knocks to go along with it. But obviously, like you said, Jack, a sentimental favorite of mine that I am really hoping runs well.
And she does have one very important thing, and that is experience at this 1.125 trip. But you mentioned it. It's the question of how much talent is really there. Gambling Girl, we already mentioned, she's a horse that's had trouble winning races. She's coming into this race. She's not a maiden, but she is coming off of 4 straight losses in Kentucky Oaks points races. So how much talent is really there in the horse that Promisher America beat for 2nd in this race? I will say one thing: if you like Gambling Girl, you really have to like Promisher America at double the price, given that Promisher America beat her in the Gazelle. And like I said, I do think that experience at the trip of this 1.125 is important for her. So that's certainly something that I will say is good. But the talent is really the biggest issue that Promisher America is going to have to overcome in this race. And I'm not really sure that she can. I don't personally know Ray Handel to the degree that Eric does, but it would certainly be incredible for him to be able to get this opportunity to have success at this type of level. And I would echo that notion from Eric. But from a looking at this race logically perspective, she has a big mountain to climb in the Kentucky Oaks. We'll move on to another horse that has a big mountain to climb, and that is Tell Me Nolies, the West Coast representative for this race. She's coming off of 2 seconds behind Bob Baffert's Feza, and Feza's a filly that I think would have been very tough to beat if she had run in the Kentucky Oaks. Of course, she's not here because of Bob Baffert's suspension, and owner Michael Lund Peterson did not switch her to Tim Yakteen. But here's the thing about Tell Me Nolies. She was a good 2-year-old filly who got exposed when she shipped out to Keeneland for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies. She went right back to California, ran 2nd in the 2 Oaks preps out there. She was beaten 2 1/4 lengths by Feza and then 6.5 lengths by Feza in the Santa Isabel and the Santa Anita Oaks in those respective races. So given that she was very well beaten in those spots, and given that the results that were on display at Keeneland when she shipped out here, she's a horse that took the opportunity to pick up the points from Santa Anita and is very much, I would say, a cut below the best types in this race.
And I'll agree with you there. I just think the California, as good as Fizz has been, the California horses have not been very strong, and I feel like she kind of showed that in the juvenile fillies last year, where she really had a lot of reasons to run well there and just did not. So I feel like that gave a good overall glimpse into her ability against these fillies on a national level. Obviously, was a good 2-year-old. Obviously, has had some decent runs this year, but you're right. I think when you watch her visually, you look at the numbers, you look at the running lines, just feels a cut below in every single way. And I'd be very hard pressed to find a reason to love her a lot in this year's Oaks.
And now we're going to move on to another horse that you can kind of apply that same rationale to, and that's Flying Connection for Todd Fincher, winner of the Sunland Park Oaks. And she has 4 wins to her career, none of them outside of the state of New Mexico. She was beaten 5th in 2 maiden races at Del Mar last summer. And pretty much an example of she's coming from the 2 races in New Mexico. She won the local prep for the Sunland Park Oaks, the Island Fashion, and then she won the Sunland Park Oaks. She won the Sunland Park Oaks in good enough fashion, but she really did not beat any quality level of racehorse in either of those 2 races. She also won the Zia Park Princess back in November at Zia Park, which is a race that we discussed on Racing Rundown, but pretty much, again, the same. She was running against the same types of horses, local, regional New Mexico horses, and her only seasoning outside of the state of New Mexico were in a couple of maiden races at Del Mar, which one of them was in the race where And Tell Me Nolies broke her maiden. And I already went through the case against And Tell Me Nolies and a horse that was beaten over 7 combined lengths by And Tell Me Nolies and the other horses in that maiden race. It's not really going to reflect well on Flying Connection, so she's another one that's a pass in this race.
Yeah, obviously the class thing is probably the biggest here. This a huge jump forward. I will say she's been impressive. She's dominated her last 2 starts, which have been around 2 turns, which might suggest that that's what she likes. But she's the biggest horse I think that's going to make this pace a little quicker than one might initially expect, and that's why I'm most hesitant. It just feels like she's got a lot of early speed and hasn't really figured out how to harness it those last 2 starts and has just won on pure ability. I don't think that could obviously be the case here, but I do think that she matters a lot in terms of how much she'll affect how her competition runs. So she'll be interesting from that respect, but that's about it. I certainly would be stretching to find a reason she could even hit the board.
And now we're going to move on to Defining Purpose, who is one horse that at least has some form from subsequent races after she ran against Wet Paint, of course, the winner of the Ashland, which we already talked about when we mentioned Wonder Wheel. This was the horse that won the Ashland Defining Purpose for Ken McPeak and Brian Hernandez Jr. She was 6th in the Honeybee and 3rd in the Martha Washington. She also won the Year's End, which was a stake for 2-year-old fillies at Oaklawn on December 31st. So basically a 3-year-old at that point. And this is a horse that's very perplexing to say the least, because she was beaten by Wet Paint on a couple of occasions pretty handily, but then she jumps up to the Ashland and a jump up in competition, and she beats the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies winner, Julia Shining, who both of us like Julia Shining, and then Punch Bowl for Brad Cox, who was a horse that came into the Ashland with a lot of upside, and she ended up going off favored in that race, and she beat them all, and I still don't really know how she was able to win the Ashland, other than the one reason that I can attach for horse underneath in that race was Julia Shining was going a bit shorter than she wanted to go in that mile and a 16th, but that doesn't really reflect why Punch Bowl didn't get past her or why Wonder Wheel ran as poorly as she did. So Defining Purpose is just a difficult horse to get a read on, and it honestly feels like one of these races, and Ken McPeak is known to do this at points, to get them ready for the prep race, have them run their A race in the prep race, and then they don't really run to form in the big one. He does this a lot with horses going into the Breeders' Cup. I'll point out And the filly's name is escaping me at the moment, but the filly that he brought to the 2020 Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies who won the Alcibiades was one. The Alcibiades was very good, and then she didn't really run to form in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies, and that kind of seems like another example of defining purpose having run her race already, and that's the reason why I will be against her in this Kentucky Oaks.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. I think another horse, not the one you were thinking of, but the horse I was thinking of was Reckless Rider, who won the Ashland before running last in the Kentucky Oaks a handful of years ago. And then Simply Ravishing was the one that you were referencing there, Jack. But I think you make a valid point there. The Ashland was such a big jump up performance, but she also sat the perfect trip. You know, the pace was pretty mundane, not too fast, not too slow, but she was able to overtake when it mattered and then just hold on for dear life while Punchbowl and Julia Shining tried to reel her in. But prior to that, she was losing to Wet Paint, also eligible tax, even further back, Hoosier Philly, and Pretty Mischievous. So she's proven time and time again to be worse. I felt like she just got the run of the race in the Ashland. Another thing I don't really love is the stretch out in distance. This was another one of those mile and 16th is a big difference than a mile and an eighth for these fillies because in the Ashland she was getting weary. And you look at her other mile and 16 starts, obviously broke her maiden at the distance, but most of her other ones, she was not finishing well. She was pretty flat-footed when it got going, and so I feel like you add another 16th onto that, it could get really, really tough for her. So the distance is actually what I don't like. I think she can sit a good little stalking outside trip, but I think what beats her at the end of the day is the fact that she can't go nine furlongs.
And now we're going to move on to the number 12 horse in this race, and that's Dorth Vader, one of the horses that fits the mold of what the Devona Dale Stakes is turning into on the Kentucky Oaks Trail, which is just a race that exists to create chaos. And Dorth Vader won the Devona Dale and then followed it up with a fourth place finish in the Gulfstream Park Oaks. She didn't really have a great record outside of Florida bred races going into the Devona Dale. She did have a run in the Sandpiper, which was I don't believe, and I do have to correct myself, that was a restricted to Florida bred races. So kind of inconsistent overall record in the exclusive to Florida bred races because she won that race and she also won the Juvenile Filly Sprint Stakes at Gulfstream in October, but then in her start before the Devona Dale was unplaced while 6th at Tampa on January 14th. Then she jumps up, runs the big race in the Devona Dale, and then she comes back down to earth in the Gulfstream Park Oaks. If you remember, way back in 2019, Geltrin is the horse that I'm going to pretty much use as the parallel to Dorth Vader because the 2021 winner of the Devona Dale did not run in the Kentucky Oaks. So that's the example that I will use. Geltrin, the winner of the 2019 Devona Dale, pretty much I will throw my comparisons of Dorth Vader to Geltrin because she just is kind of coming into this Kentucky Oaks with a very similar record and form as Geltrin was, a horse that got the opportunity to spring an upset in one race and came back down to earth after that.
I really like that comparison, Jack, and I think it rings true. You know, in the Gulfstream Park Oaks, she made a pretty premature move, which is why I'm guessing they found a new rider for this Kentucky Oaks. But I felt like that she looked pretty loaded throughout, and you know, she broke out where she was wide throughout. So she already had some things going against her, and then moved a touch too early on the turn, made the lead too early, and then nothing for the stretch. The Devona Dale, obviously, she won for fun, but it was a weak group, mainly sprinters on top of that, and she's proven to be beatable at their time. So, yeah, I agree. She got the perfect run in the Devona Dale. I think you can make an excuse for the Gulfstream Park Oaks loss in moving too early, but I also don't think that moves her up enough to be a contender here.
And now we're going to move on to number 13, Affirmative Lady, the winner of that Gulfstream Park Oaks. And Affirmative Lady was a very interesting horse because Grand Motion shot very high with her throughout the course of the winter. She ran while still a maiden, and the Demoiselle very nearly got there against Julia Shining while running second there, and then she was third in the Busanda, both of those going this 1.125 trip, and then she was dropped down, finally broke her maiden, and then jumped into the Gulfstream Park Oaks, where she won that race in pretty nice fashion. And it was a race that I actually liked the win in the Gulfstream Park Oaks very well, or very much, and I thought that she very well might be my pick in the couple of weeks leading up to the Kentucky Oaks when I was just internally pondering it. But looking at it, it was just a very weak group of horses all around. She wasn't really beating a whole lot there, and I also don't love that a couple of times going 1.125 she got passed late. Now, Julia Shining's a nice horse, but the Busanda, and she wasn't on the lead, she didn't make the lead at any point in the Busanda, but she also just was never winning it. She was well beaten while 7th on that day, so that's something. She was a nose away from being, she was in a nose finish with Swedish Princess, who was 4th in that race, and as I said, they were both beaten 7 lengths, so how is the trip, move up in trip going to serve her? I really don't think it's going to serve her that well. I think her win in the Gulfstream Park Oaks was a good win in a vacuum, but I don't really think she beat a whole lot. And I think that while this is a weak group of horses, I still think she's coming out of one of the weaker prep wins, even though she was a horse that I did think about because her race was visually very good, but I think it could be one of those visual fool races that it fools you because it looks good visually, but once you dig a little bit deeper, it's not quite as good as it looks in a vacuum, and that's the reason why I will be against Affirmative Lady in this race.
Yeah, and I'll disagree with you a little bit on the distance question. I think that's probably where she excels. I think she has the 2 efforts at the 1.125. One wasn't great. One was pretty solid, and that was in the Demoiselle. The Busanda was the tough one. But I just think she needed a little bit of confidence booster after the Busanda. She got that winning the maiden special weight. And then in the Gulfstream Park Oaks, obviously, she looked really good. But overall, with your assessment, I agree. She just did not feel like she was finishing so much better than everyone else, as much as beating a lesser group of horses. So that's kind of where I drew the line. We saw it on a few occasions just being as good or worse than some of the average contenders in this year's Kentucky Oaks. I think her best chance, though, is just hit a good mid-pack trip, make one big run, and maybe if they back up enough to her, she'll be finishing off late. Kind of a toss-up, but I think the prep just was not dazzling enough to fully want to run with her.
And now we're going to move on to the second of 2 Godolphin fillies in this race and the final of the horses that are in the body of the field right now, and that's Pretty Mischievous, winner of 2 stakes races on the Kentucky Oaks Trail, the Silver Bullet Day, the Untappable, and the Rachel Alexander. I mixed up my Kentucky Oaks winners there, forgive me for that. And then also second in the Fairgrounds Oaks, and she was a horse that I liked her Untappable win a lot, and I think she really moved forward from those couple of races. She obviously beat the Alys Look and she beat Hoosier Philly and Chop Chop in that race. Chop Chop grade 1 placed. I already mentioned her when we were talking about the Alys Look, and then Hoosier Philly, who is just Hoosier Philly. Again, we mentioned her. She was the Kentucky Oaks favorite over the course of the winter, but I thought that her 2 stakes wins on the Kentucky Oaks Trail were good races. I think she improved from the Untappable into the Rachel Alexander, and I think she did take another step forward in the mile and a 16th Fairgrounds Oaks. The problem is she's buried outside, and she's a horse that, if you like her, you probably also have to like Southlawn, and Southlawn is going to get the much better trip than Pretty Mischievous will. And I wonder if I'm not overly concerned about her getting the trip, because even though she is by Into Mischief, she's out of a Tappet mare, so she'll probably be fine, but from a distance perspective. But I just don't love getting buried out side in the 14, coming off of a 3-length defeat where the horse that beat her gets a significantly better draw and will get a significantly better trip than she does in this race.
Definitely. The post position is what really is going to hurt her here. She's been ultra consistent, probably one of the most consistent in the crop, and the win of the Rachel Alexandra was a very strong win, even though she kind of tripped out. Fairgrounds Oaks was kind of the flip side. She was closer to a kind of stalking a pretty hot pace, and while she made the lead, she didn't have enough to hold on the oncoming traffic. So, while it's kind of in a tale of two worlds there with those last two setups, the talent is no matter what very, very apparent. But I think the post hurts, and I do wonder how the blinkers going on are going to affect her. I wonder if that's going to put more speed into already a fast horse. Does that kind of help her, or does that hurt her in terms of this setup? Because the blinkers going on to me means that she's going to maybe even be more forwardly placed, which could force a pace that already looks a little hot. So that could once again help everybody else out. I certainly don't think it would relax her, which in hindsight, I'm sure the connections wish they could modify and take those blinkers back off, because they're definitely not going to want her to use up too much while also being on that outside post.
And now we're going to very briefly mention the also eligibles. There's two that we're going to take a quick look at, and then one that we obviously have to spend some time on. If you know Racing Rundown, you know which horse that's going to be. But number 15, Taxed, for Randy Moore. She would be the first horse that would draw in if there is a defection. One win at the maiden claiming level, was second behind Wet Paint in the fantasy, but she was well beaten enough in the fantasy and just kind of, poor run in the Honeybee. She kind of ran sort of in every other race streak. That's not to say that she's an every other race horse, but she ran in an every other race streak. One good finish, then one not so good finish, then one good finish, then one bad finish at Oaklawn. Just a horse that will be a cut above. We'll skip over number 16, Julia Shining, just to mention Hoosier Philly. Hoosier Philly, very good at 2. Just kind of seems like the pack is caught up with her at this point, and she's also obviously exceedingly unlikely to draw into this race because she needs 3 horses to come out in front of her, which does not seem very likely to happen. I'm going to toss it over to Eric to talk about Julia Shining, because we have to talk about Julia Shining because this is Racing Rundown, and because this is Racing Rundown, Julia Shining did not make the Kentucky Oaks, so we can't pick her to win the Kentucky Oaks.
Exactly, but I do think if she gets in, she's going to be a very big threat. Obviously, a very talented 2-year-old, won her first 2 races, and then this year has just been a victim of circumstance. In the Suncoast, she was coming late, but she kind of powdered along the entire way. They had the blinkers. They sharpened her up, but she just ran out of ground. She is the definition of that horse who needs a mile and an eighth to really do her best work. Mentally, she's still trying to figure things out. So when you take away the other factors, it hurts her even more. She reminds me a lot of a Wonder Godot. I remember texting you that a few weeks back and making that comparison. But Wonder Godot, a very talented 2-year-old, but struggled in her preps because she was never really able to go 9 furlongs. Well, she got to 9 furlongs in the Oaks, and she relished it. And I don't think it's any different for Julia Shining. Obviously, being a full sister to an Oaks winner helps you out quite a bit on that front. But I think when you draw the parallels to similar horses who have ran well in the Kentucky Oaks, on that distance equation, it makes a lot of sense. So I'm really hopeful she draws in. She will be my top pick if she gets in.
Yeah, she would be my top pick if she draws in too, because I think she's a horse that just needs every single yard of a mile and an eighth. And I've been saying that since the Demoiselle. And I was afraid that this was going to happen with her because the Suncoast, okay, that was really it was run that, which is a mile and 40, not her ideal trip, or cut her back to 7 furlongs or a 1-turn mile. So you really had no other choice to run her there. But I was afraid that the moment that she ran in the Ashland that this was going to happen, that she was not going to run well. She was going to run her typical race, needs more ground, and not accumulate the points to get into the Kentucky Oaks. And unfortunately, she's sitting on the outside looking in going into this Kentucky Oaks because she doesn't have the points. But if she gets in, she's going to relish every single yard of the mile and an eighth, but she's also going to need every single yard of the mile and an eighth. And she's a horse that she's a bicycle. You don't ride her, she doesn't run. That's how she looked hopelessly beat in her debut. She won there. She looked like she was going to lose to Demoiselle. She was exceedingly wide, all that stuff. She won anyway. If she gets into this race, she's going to be a massive threat, but she's on the outside looking in right now, and it looks like we'll have to wait 2 weeks till we get to see her run at her ideal trip. With that being said, I'll toss it back to Eric for you to give your top pick in this race before I will come back with my top pick and we will wrap things up on this Kentucky Oaks preview.
My pick in this year's Oaks is going to be Southlawn, a filly who checks the boxes that need to be checked in this year's race, whereas a lot of these horses have been doing the same thing their entire career. Southlawn is in taking those necessary steps forward with 2 big wins this year, and just has that newfound confidence that I was mentioning earlier that are going to make her so successful in this race. Additionally, she's going to get that extra 16th of ground that we've mentioned being so essential to the success of Kentucky Oaks winners or horses that have run well in the race. And finally, I just think she gets the right trip. The pace is going to be on the quicker side. It might not set up for your wet paints of the world, but it could set up for your Southlawns who are coming from mid-pack or slightly farther behind. So I'm really excited. I just think she's moving in the right direction and can capitalize on it here in the Kentucky Oaks.
And my pick is going to be Botanical for Brad Cox and Chris Landeros in this race. I'm a little bit nervous about how much early foot I think that there could be in this race. And also she doesn't have a start on dirt this in her career. But at the same time, she has done it from the wins perspective. And Turfway shippers have enough success at Churchill Downs that I'm willing to swallow a couple of the issues that she has going into this race because she does have 2 very strong wins in Stakes Company, and then the 2 wins in Maiden and Allowance Company in those starts before that. So she checks enough boxes for me that she's going to be my choice in this race. And with that being said, that's going to be it for our Kentucky Oaks preview. I think that this is the most in-depth that we've ever gone on a Kentucky Oaks preview here on Racing Rundown, so we hope we were able to help you out. Be sure to check out our Kentucky Derby preview and our episode of Racing Rundown this week. Links to those will be below in the description. We'll see you next time. Have a good one.